Hey guys and girl, my name is Sean, also known as Sean KF, and I would like to welcome you to another Killing Floor 2 SDK video guide. In this short little video, we will be taking a look at Lightmap Resolutions and how you, as a level designer, can use and control the shadows that happens on your map. I will be talking a little bit about the different types of shadows, primarily dynamic shadows and static shadows, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of these two types. I've created a small demo map here, as you can see, everything here is baseline standard. What that means is that everything is pulled into the map directly from the content browser, and I have changed very, very few settings on them. So basically, these are regular meshes. I've applied some materials to them, but otherwise, all other settings on these meshes, these walls and floors, are default. So this is exactly what it would look like if you were to pull them directly from the content browser into your map. I haven't made any changes at all. There are some spotlights here. I've made some minor changes to them. I've increased the inner cone angle up to 20. I have increased the radius to 1200, and that's it. I haven't changed anything else. Everything else is unmodified. So again, all of this is exactly the same as it would be if you were to drag them directly into your map. There are no preset settings in this demo. And as we look at this, at the start, at very first, we see these, as you can see, I've put up these spotlights behind these gratings with a couple of walls here, as well as a staircase, all of which are shining light and shadow onto the floor and walls behind them. And now at default settings, this is the result. This is what it looks like. It's not amazingly spectacular to look at, is it? Basically, we can't even see any shadows on these walls from these gratings. And we do see shadows from this staircase, but they're not exactly good looking, are they? Why is that? And what can we do about it? That's exactly what we will be talking about in this video. I'll show you how we can improve these and why you may want to do it or why you may not want to do it. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the two primary types of shadows that you will be using as a level designer, and those are dynamic shadows and static shadows. So let's just start with the dynamic shadows. First of all, we gotta make sure that we have dynamic shadows here. The way that we do that is, first of all, we open up the properties of our light. We tick this one, cast whole scene dynamic shadows. We activate this, and nothing happened. That's weird, because we have this grating, so this should be casting shadows. But let's just check that we've set it to actually cast dynamic shadows, because by default, they may not be doing that. We tick this, and what do you know? Nothing happens. So if this happens, you might be wondering, what the flutch is going on? Because dynamic shadows do not require you to rebuild light. What we need to do in the case of this type of material is make sure that you have this option, cast shadow as two-sided, checked. Watch what happens. There we go. Now we have some really beautiful, crisp dynamic shadows. This looks really good. Let's just go ahead and rebuild everything so that we make sure that our light is built. And as we can see, these dynamic shadows are absolutely gorgeous. But when we move away, they vanish, they disappear. We get close, they reappear. Move away, they disappear. Move close, they reappear. Now, why is this? This is because dynamic shadows are, as the name suggests, dynamic. That means they are rendered and calculated in real time. They are not pre-rendered. They are not baked into the map as static shadows are. No, they're being rendered and calculated as the editor and the game is actually running. And what the disadvantage of these dynamic shadows is that having these amount of calculations, everything has to be calculated. The light frustum, the angle, everything that moves in front of them, Everything is a real-time calculation that your CPU is constantly performing mathematical equations on. And if you have a lot of these dynamic shadows in your map, like imagine an entire map filled with dynamic shadows that, let's just say, they have endless draw distance. They don't, but if they did, your computer would pretty much catch on fire, because the amount of calculations that your CPU has to make there's a lot. It's a big strain on your CPU, and it's not very performance friendly to have a lot of dynamic shadows. This is why, by default, dynamic shadows will fade away at a certain distance. I'm not sure what the actual distance is. I think it's about... what is this? It's about 900? 700 maybe? I think it's roughly 900 units when the dynamic shadows will fade away. So the disadvantage of these dynamic shadows is that they cost a lot of performance to render. It's especially hard on your CPU, not so much your graphics card. It's mostly a CPU thing, according to what I know anyway. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here. I am no expert on this field. The advantage of dynamic shadows is that they just look beautiful. They look amazing, don't they? They look really, really good. They're extremely sharp. They're very crisp. And if you move things in front of them, if objects start moving, the dynamic shadows... Oops, let me just get down to a proper... See, the dynamic shadows actually adjust themselves in real time. And this just looks amazing. So that's the advantage of dynamic shadows. They just look very good. But you don't want to be using them everywhere all the time, because they do increase the amount of CPU usage. And if people have an older CPU, it may become a problem. There's not a whole lot else to say about dynamic shadows, or not much that I would like to say. So let's take a look at the static shadows. Now, static shadows, we don't have any over here. Why is that? We actually do have a bit of shadowing going on here. It's very difficult to see. And we are casting shadows. This is set to cast shadows. With static shadows, we should not need to tick the cast shadows as two-sided. I'm just going to do it anyway to be safe. Let's just try rebuilding, and this should not have done any difference. It did not. So why are we not seeing shadows with this light? Because as you can see, this light is set to cast static shadows, but not whole scene dynamic shadows. So why are there no shadows? Well, in actuality, there are shadows, because as we can see, there are shadows over here. We can clearly see shadows. They're not very pretty. They look pretty terrible, but they are there. And this light also is not casting, whole scene dynamic shadows. It is only casting static shadows. So how come we can see the shadows here, but not over here? And that is simply because this fence, these are so delicate, they're so small, so fine, that the shadows that are being cast onto this floor and wall, they get so washed out because our Lightmap resolution is very low. And this is very important to understand what the Lightmap resolution is. Because the primary difference between dynamic shadows, the ones that are cast in real time, and static shadows, as these, is that static shadows are baked into your map materials. Basically, the way that you can think about them is that they are painted onto your walls and floors and your entire map. It's like someone went around with a paintbrush and calculated what would these shadows look on this wall. Okay, they would be up here, so I'll take a paint bucket of black paint and I will paint black shadows on this wall all across. That's essentially what static shadows are. They are painted onto your environment, or a more technical term would be baked into the environment. And the advantage of having static shadows is, first of all, they are not rendered in real time. There is no strain on your CPU to calculate these shadows, because technically they're not there. They're not actually shadows. Technically, these are not shadows. They are just dark splotches painted onto your map to look like shadows. They emulate shadows. What that means is, no matter how far we go away, they don't vanish. You see the dynamic shadows? They only appear when we are within a certain proximity, and then they go away. The static shadows are painted onto the environment so they don't go anywhere. That's a huge advantage in terms of performance, but the disadvantage of static shadows is, first of all, these shadow maps are stored as materials within your map packages, which means they increase the file size of your map, and they also increase the memory load, the stuff that needs to be loaded into memory. Dynamic shadows are not loaded into memory because they are calculated in real time. So there's no memory usage from the dynamic shadows. But the static shadows eat up memory. It's so little that generally you don't need to worry about it. Another disadvantage, as we can see, is they're not very pretty, are they? They look pretty bad. Luckily, we can change that. And the way that we do that is, let's go back to this one, because as I said, this is actually casting shadows. There are static shadows here. They are just so washed out that we cannot see them because this is so fine. These are so delicate, and the light map resolution is so low. 64 is not very high for such a large mesh. So what we want to do is click this checkbox, override light map resolution, and then we can enter a number in this field. Now, pay attention, because it's very important to understand that when you are working with the light map, overwritten light map resolutions, they must be in a factor of 2. Always in a factor of 2. That means any value between 4, and the double of 4 is 8, the double of 8 is 16, the double of 16 is 32, 64, which is the default, as you can see. The next is 128. Basically, you just multiply the number by 2, right? 128, and then 256, then 512, then 1024, 2048, and then we get into 4096, and from there on it gets so high that I can't actually remember it, and I'm not very good at math, but I'm not going to calculate it because anything above 1024 is pretty much the upper limit. Anything above this number is really, really unnecessary. But let's just go back to, let's have a look at this. This is defaulted at 64. So what if we double that? What if we double it to 128? Keep in mind, when you do these overwritten light maps with static shadows, you do need to rebuild the light every time you make a change in order for it to show up. So let's try rebuilding. Now we've set it at 128, and it's not a huge difference. Something kind of happened out here. Something did happen, but it wasn't really all that much. So what if we try 256? You see that? As soon as I changed the number, all the shadows went away and it defaulted back to a completely blank. So we have to rebuild, and oh, now something's actually happening. Now we can actually see the shadows. They're not just a washed out soup of gray matter. Now we can actually sort of, they don't look very good though, and the floor is completely missing. That's because the floor is still defaulted at 64. What if we increase this to 256 to correspond to our wall? Then we should get these fairly not super good looking shadows. We can barely even tell they're there. So why don't we double this to 512 and see what happens now? Rebuild. And voila. It's like magic, isn't it? This looks a lot better. They're still a bit fuzzy compared to the dynamic. Look at the dynamic. Completely crisp, super sharp. I could just eat these shadows. But these, well, they're okay. They're okay. This is very decent. But we can do even better, because let's go to 1024 and see what happens now. Now we're going to get something that's very close to actual dynamic shadows. The build time increases, the shadow map resolution increases, the map file size increases, and the memory load increases. But the quality definitely also increases. You see this? This is almost dynamic shadow quality. It's pretty close. It's not quite there, but it's very, very close. Most people will not be able to tell the difference. Seriously. And the advantage, as said before, if we move away, the dynamic shadows disappear, but our baked shadows stay. Doesn't matter how far away we go, they stay on the map because they are painted. A small happy elf with a green beard has went around and painted these with a small toothbrush and black paint. That's a true story, kids. I am not kidding. So these walls out here, they're still defaulted at 64, and we can very easily see the difference, right? You see that? You can clearly see the separator. If we increase this one to 1024 as well, the difference becomes even more apparent because now these shadows will reflect onto this and look just as good as over here. But again, look at the encoded shadow maps. It raised from 4 to 5. Every time you increase the shadow maps and add more meshes with high shadow maps, Lightmap Resolutions, sorry, the shadow maps of your map will increase. And if we actually go into our map package, external, light design, Lightmap Res, you see this? These are our shadow maps. These are the emulated fake shadows that are being painted onto our environment. And these are saved within our package, and that's why the file size increases. And the memory load, because the game has to load these shadow maps into memory. So the more we have of these, the more stuff needs to be loaded into memories. The main disadvantage of this is just an increased loading time of your map. The actual map performance is so insignificant that you don't have to worry about it. It really only increases the loading time of your map. Now we can do the same thing on these over here, just for good measure. We can increase these to 1000. Why do I keep clicking 1, 2? 1024. We rebuilt the light, and now we get these really nice projected stair painted baked shadows. We just increased from 5 to 9. So again, it is increasing our file size, but our map looks a lot better. Can you see that? The difference is huge, absolutely huge. So that's pretty much the basics of this little tutorial here. I don't really have a whole lot else to show you in terms of this. I do have a little something that I want to show you in just a minute, because I just spent some time making a very clear comparison. Because one last thing that I want to mention here is what kind of shadow maps should you be using? You as a mapper, you as a level designer, what's a good number? Now, keep in mind that the game generates, when you pull a new mesh into your map, the game will generate an automatic default shadow map resolution, generally based on the size of the mesh. This means that when you pull in different meshes, you get different default Lightmap resolutions. So if I were to pull in a floor that's 8 by 8, a really big floor like this, and I build the light, this floor is most likely going to be defaulted at 256 Lightmap resolution, which is a pretty decent shadow resolution. Let's just see once it finishes encoding the shadows. Whereas these smaller, these 2x2 floors, they were defaulted to 64. This one is defaulted to 256, as you see. And that's because the engine generates the default Lightmap resolution based on the size of the mesh. So the bigger the mesh is, the larger the Lightmap resolution is going to be generated by default. But getting back to what kind of Lightmap resolutions you should be using for your map, the general consensus is that 128 is the lower end of decent looking shadows, right? If you want shadows that look decent but are in the lower end scale, you should be aiming for about 128. Now, the kind of shadow, the Lightmap resolutions you want also depends a lot on what kind of shadows you want to be reflected onto the surface. So for these types of very fine, delicate shadows, we can already see that 128 is far too low. This doesn't work. But over here, these are much larger, much more massive shadows. 128 is going to be more acceptable than it is for these fine shadows, as we will be able to see in just a few seconds. See this? This is 128. I mean, they're pretty cheap. They don't look super good, which is why I call them the decent lower end scale of shadows. As long as you only have, large meshes projecting large shadows, you can get away with 128 and still have it look pretty decent. But with very fine shadows, such as from these fences, 128 is just way too low. It doesn't work at all. You can't even see them. So, in terms of the numbers, 256 is sort of the mid-scale. This is the mid-scale of fairly good-looking shadow maps that you're going to get with 256. And it's generally the highest number that the engine will automatically generate for you is 256. So it's a very decent value to be using across your map. 256 is going to work out pretty well in most situations. We see these large shadows at 256. This is perfectly acceptable. This is very mid-range. It's very decent. It doesn't look terrible, but it doesn't look super good either. And over here, it's a bit, I wouldn't be happy with this. But these are, like I said, these are very fine shadows. If we increase to 512, 512 is what I consider high-end Lightmap resolutions. 512 is good for very fine shadows, such as these fences, but it might be a bit overkill on larger shadows, such as with these stairs over here. We don't really need 512 for these shadows over here. The difference between 256 and 512 is not that noticeable when we are dealing with large shadows, but it's definitely noticeable over here. And as you can see, this is a very decent shadow map. It's not super crisp, but it definitely looks nice. 512 is very acceptable. 1024, that's the luxury scale. That is literally luxury. You don't really need to go that high unless you want some really, really crisp shadows, which in the case of these kind of fences, I think 1024 is, you can justify doing it. But for meshes like this one over here with the stairs, 1024 is, in my opinion, that's definitely overkill. You definitely don't need 1024 on a mesh like, for shadows like these. 512 is the upper limit, I would say. You don't need to go above 512, and I would even say 256 would be acceptable. We can go even higher. The next step is 2046, but the difference between 1024 and 2048 is the next step. The difference between 1024 and 2048 is so small that nobody in their right mind will notice. The only person who might notice is you, because you literally made the map, but anyone else viewing your map will not be able to tell the difference. And I'm going to show you the one last thing before we end this tutorial, because there really is nothing else to it. This is how you do shadows. This is how they work. The advantages, the disadvantages, the differences between the different shadow maps. And keep in mind, you can override these Lightmap resolutions on everything. Every single mesh has a Lightmap resolution, but not every single mesh needs to have overridden Lightmap resolutions. Especially with very small items, like if you have something like this, for example. This tiny little, this is a piece of one of these railings. If you have one of these in your map that is being hit by shadows, you don't want to set a 1024 Lightmap resolution on such a tiny item, because nobody's going to notice. It really won't be noticeable. If you look out for it, yes, it probably will be noticeable. We'll just see right now. But for actual gameplay, when you're running around playing the game, shooting sets, trying to survive, nobody is going to notice whether you set the light map resolution on a small item like this to its default 32 or if you set it to 1024. That it's really, really nitpicking, and it's total overkill. If you want to do it, fine, go ahead and do it. You can do it on every single mesh, and it does make a difference, yes, but the general rule of thumb is that for small items, small meshes such as these, you don't really need to set a very high light map resolution. For the most part, in like 99% of the cases, you just let the engine generate a default light map resolution for small meshes, and it'll be perfectly fine. Okay, so the last thing that I want to show you is I want to open up a map, light map comparison that I made just before starting this video actually, and it's a nifty little tool here that I compiled that shows very clearly the difference between the different shadow light map resolutions. This is light map resolution 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, all the way up to 2048. And as you can see, if we compare this is 1024 and this is 2048 with very fine, delicate items, very delicate shadows like these. There is a distinct difference. We can definitely tell a difference. 2048 looks a lot better, but for the most, actually, I think there's something wrong here. Have I made a mistake? Now, see, this is interesting. Now that I'm looking at this is actually very interesting. Because, I've never noticed this. Is it because I haven't built the light? The 512 light map actually looks better than the 1024. That doesn't make any sense. I'm kind of wondering what's going on here. I didn't even check this. Like I said, I literally just made this before starting this video. So these might be technical difficulties, or they might be an engine thing. I don't even know. Now I'm curious. There's a very distinct difference in these shadows. And I think they are still there. No, okay. It was my mistake. Apparently I hadn't rebuilt the light probably. Because yes, I was kind of confused. Because as I was saying earlier, the difference between 1024 and 2048 is really, really, really difficult to notice. Like, you can see the difference, especially on very thin shadows. There is definitely a difference. When you go up close, when you go at a distance, there's almost no difference. These are a bit sharper. The 2048 are a bit sharper. The 1024 are a bit more blurred. But for actual gameplay, when you're running around in the game, having the difference between 1024 and 2048 is very, very negligible. And the amount of extra shadow map memory usage and disk space usage at 2048 is pretty significant. It's not worth it. In my opinion, it's not worth it. But it's up to you. You can clearly see the difference here. 4 is the lowest value. You cannot go below 4. I know logically you should be able to go down to 2, but you can't. Don't ask me why. I don't know. 4 is the minimum. I don't know if the engine has an upper limit, but anywhere between, anything above 2048 is completely ridiculous. And as I was saying, 128, this is sort of the discount static shadows. They work if you want some very cheap shadows, but they're not especially pretty. 256 is kind of decent, especially at a distance. If you're far away, 256 actually looks pretty good. But the closer you get, they start looking not so good. 512 is like the that's what I call the high-end shadows without being overly expensive. And they really do look very decent. Even close up, they look very decent. And 1024, that's the luxury ones. 2048 is complete overkill. So there you have it, guys. A little video describing how to differentiate between dynamic shadows, between static shadows, how to use them, how to do overridden light map resolution, and a general rule of thumb on when, where, and how to override your light map resolutions to give your map some nicer looking shadows. I hope you find this video guide helpful. Feel free to browse through some of my other guides. There will be more coming in the future. And I wish you all the best luck. I hope you enjoy mapping as much as the rest of us, so that we get more high quality custom maps for Killing Floor 2. It's certainly a lovely game that certainly deserves it. With that said, go spice up your custom maps with some better shadows. If you were not aware of this already, now you can make your maps look a little better. Have fun, have a good one, take care of yourself, and goodbye.